Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part four as we look at the first portion of Christianity. And we left off with an introduction to the Apostle Paul, but I wanted to mention a couple more things with that last point about how the main theme of Paul's theology is that the death of Jesus did away with the Jewish Torah slash law. And I mentioned how this is one of the earliest controversial issues within the Christian movement because the Torah, the law, the 613 commandments is really the heart of Judaism. The Ten Commandments are just but 10 of the 613 laws, and modern day Jews cannot follow all of the 613 commandments because a lot of them relate to the temple system, the temple cult, and there is no longer a temple. The Romans destroyed it during the First Roman Jewish War. But to say something a little bit more with that, I referenced how arguably Peter perhaps was kind of a bridge between Paul, who held that the death of Jesus did away with the Jewish Torah, the law, and James, who was Jesus's brother slash kinsman. And you see this in the book of Acts, where James is pretty big with still, maintaining a lot of the commandments of the Torah slash law, that perhaps, the Ten Commandments was Peter kind of, creating a truce between them. Um, One thing I wanted to mention that in Paul's writings, both those that everyone agrees that he wrote and then those that are disputed, he does mention 9 out of the 10 commandments. The only one that he does not mention, or I should say, he mentions 8 out of the 10 commandments. He is shown in the book of Acts celebrating the Eucharist, so we could say observing the Sabbath. But the one that he doesn't reference is not taking the name of God in vain. He doesn't reference that. But anyway, so moving on here, Christianity's Catholic Orthodox. Catholic Orthodoxy is the form of Christianity which ultimately won. All modern day Christians descend directly or indirectly from Catholic Orthodoxy. So Catholic Orthodoxy, it's the form of Christianity which ultimately won. All modern day Christians descend directly or indirectly from Catholic Orthodoxy. I used to have with this lecture the other Christianities who are considered the losers in this, and from the perspective of Catholic Orthodoxy, they're considered heretical. But you had one group that's known as the adoptionists slash Ebionites. They held that Jesus was the biological son of Mary and Joseph, so they rejected the idea of a virgin birth, but that he became God's adopted son at his baptism by John the Baptizer, John the Baptist. They held that the death of Jesus did away with the sacrificial offerings, the sin offerings of the Torah, but that other portions of the Torah or law, such as circumcision and the dietary laws, needed to be maintained. Paul refers to them in the letter to the Galatians as the Judaizers, and they pretty much viewed Paul as heretical. Another group, which was a variety of different forms, was the Gnostics. And like I mentioned a moment ago, there was not one form of Gnosticism, but many. But Gnostics, some, not all, held the view that, Jesus really wasn't a flesh and blood human being. He only appeared to be one, but he was actually a pure spirit. Um, they held that the God of Abraham was an evil God, but the God of Jesus was a good God, that Jesus essentially came down from the heavenly realm to liberate those from the Abrahamic God. But, all modern day, but those groups were the losers. They were declared heretical by Catholic Orthodoxy. Catholic Orthodoxy is the form that won. And all modern day Christians descend directly or indirectly from Catholic Orthodoxy. So, if you're Catholic or you're Orthodox, You have a direct connection there because that was the united form until, keeping it simple, the Great Schism of 1054. Whereas if, say, you're Methodists, you have more of an indirect relationship because the Methodist Church comes out of the Church of England, as John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, was a priest of the Church of England, and the Church of England comes out of the Catholic Church. So, if you're Methodist, more of an indirect relationship here. But Catholic Orthodoxy, it produced the Bible as we would conceive of it, and the historic Christian creeds, such as the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. The Bible, as we would conceive of it, of course, we're referring to both the Jewish and the Christian scriptures, essentially comes from the canon of Saint Athanasius of Alexandria, who was Bishop of Alexandria, and his list essentially carried on throughout the Christian world. Well, Athanasius of Alexandria was a bishop in the Catholic Orthodox faith, and also the historic Christian creeds such as the Apostles' Creed, which was a creed essentially to try to weed out Gnostics, and then the Nicene Creed, which essentially is the creed that defines the Holy Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity. But essentially, Catholic Orthodoxy produced the Bible as we would conceive of it, held that Jesus was born of a virgin, that Jesus is God incarnate, et cetera, et cetera. So now a little bit here with the early church and persecution. In the year 64 CE/AD, the city of Rome is destroyed by a fire. This is what is known as the Great Fire of Rome, and historians debate on how it was that the fire actually happened. And the debate essentially runs from intentional to accidental. Well, the Roman emperor at the time, Nero, he places the blame for the fire on Christians and he begins to persecute them. Nero is the first Roman emperor to persecute Christians, and he gets dubbed, many historians would argue, he's the individual who's dubbed as the beast in the book of Revelation, that the number 666 um, is gematria for Nero's name in Hebrew. But, in the case with Nero, he was not a popular emperor. He hated the city of Rome. He actually wanted to move the capital to Naples, but public pressure would not allow him to do so. So there's the argument, and historians dispute it, that Nero may have ordered the city of Rome to be burned, i.e., that the fire was caused intentionally, so then he could rebuild the city in a manner that he liked. If that is true, if that is what happened, then obviously the plans did not go quite the way that Nero wanted. So Nero, who's not a popular emperor anyway, he needs to find a scapegoat. So he places the blame for the fire on Christians. And Tacitus, who was a Roman senator and historian, he mentions the notion of both regarding the fire being intentional to accidental. Um, he talks about the persecution of Christians. He's not a fan of them. He refers to them as a superstition coming out of Judea, and how the person that started it, Jesus, was crucified by the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, when Tiberius was the Roman emperor. But he also mentions how that the people of Rome knew that these Christians were being persecuted basically as a distraction for, Nero's own problems. And the persecution of Christians under Nero, it resulted in the deaths of Saints Peter and Paul in Rome. Peter, and I have the image here below, was crucified. The tradition is that he was crucified upside down. The upside down cross is traditionally the cross of St. Peter. That may have been a little bit of early Christian piety, but he was most certainly crucified. That we can tell. In terms of Paul, he was a Roman citizen, so he ended up getting beheaded. And being beheaded was considered a much more merciful death. Because how a person dies from crucifixion is ultimately that their lungs collapse. If Peter had been crucified upside down, he likely would not have suffered in quite the same manner that Jesus did, because more than likely he would have died in his sleep. But if he was crucified in the same way that Jesus was, he would have suffered in a very, similar manner. So now let's look at the sacraments. Of the word sacrament, it means sacred in Latin, but mystery in Greek. So the word sacrament, it means sacred in Latin, but mystery in Greek. On the Eastern side, they often refer to these particular rituals as the mysteries, whereas in the West, they're referred to as the sacraments. Um, St. Augustine of Hippo, the early church father and bishop of Hippo, he referred to the sacraments as a visible sign of invisible grace or a visible sign of the invisible God. Now, traditionally in Christianity, there are 7 sacraments. You don't need to write the 7 down, but I will have them here on the screen. You have baptism, the Eucharist slash Holy Communion, confirmation, reconciliation, which is commonly referred to as confession, marriage, the holy orders or the priesthood, and then the extreme unction, or commonly referred to as the last rites. But of the traditional 7, the 2 that have stood out the most historically are baptism and the Eucharist, the Holy Communion. Might as well mention that the word Eucharist in Greek, it means thanksgiving. Baptism, it has a multiple different meanings. It can mean to dip, to wash, or to immerse. But of the traditional 7, the 2 that have stood out the most historically are baptism and the Eucharist. So let's look a little bit at one of them right now. We won't get to the next one until later. But baptism is the manner in which a person enters the church, and it's seen as a replacement for circumcision. So baptism, it's seen as the manner in which a person, enters the church, belongs into the community, is how a person is now brought into the covenant with Abraham, the God of Abraham, and it's seen as the replacement for circumcision. Whereas in the Jewish tradition, how one entered the covenant of Abraham was, excuse me, to be circumcised for the male child that was 8 days after birth. Uh, Baptism within the Christian tradition is seen as the replacement for circumcision. So now through baptism, the person is brought into the covenant with the God of Abraham and becomes a member of the church. Well, we need to stop here but we will continue on later.